So, good evening, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on from where you are joining us. We have the honor and the great pleasure to welcome you all to our international symposium dealing with violence, resolving conflicts in Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. As you might all know, we had to postpone it again and again due to the COVID pandemic, but good news, our conference will finally be realized and, as it were, inaugurated by 2 digital panel sections today and tomorrow. They thus precede the real-time conference that will take place from July 25th to 27th at Herrenhausen Castle in Hanover. This also means that there will be no official opening section tonight, but we will jump straight into a core topic of our symposium. We are very grateful that our presenters, Dr. Elisa Cruz Ureda from the Universidad Autónoma de Chiapas, Dr. Joseph Mujere from National University of Lesotho, and Dr. Philipp Nauke from Philipps Universität in Marburg have kindly agreed to share this digital endeavor with us. Welcome, and a big thank you for that. We will present and introduce you more in detail to the auditorium in the course of our meeting tonight. Just a few introductory words on the two of us who will chair this session. We are both members of the Center for Atlantic and Global Studies at Leibniz University, Hanover. Wolfgang Gabbard, my co-chair, is a professor at the Institute for Sociology with the specialties of cultural anthropology and the sociology of development. I hold the professorship on African history in the history department of our university. Now to the format of our session. All 3 papers will be presented one after the other. Each speaker has 20 minutes. In order to allow a possibly equal share of time for all 3, we invite you to please keep to this time limit. A small clock with a countdown in a blue field will assist you surely for that. After the presentations, we should have about 30 minutes for discussion. And all those who are joining via the live stream have the opportunity to post questions and please short comments in the chat at any time. We will then forward these to the speakers. Please do not forget to put your name and, if you can, to ask your questions directly in English. If not, we will take care to translate them ourselves. So far to the technical and practical issues. Local communities, resource exploitation and the state, such the title of our panel, is, as I already mentioned, to be considered a core topic of our conference, inasmuch as the extraction of natural resources, their appropriation, and the disposal of the yields mark a field of tension ripe with conflict and violence of the first order worldwide. This applies especially, but not only, to societies in the global south, which have been forced under colonial rule over extended periods of time, primarily because of their resources. How conflict dynamics in this regard have changed in the post-colonial era under globalized conditions, and what role state and parastatal instances play in this context is, among other things, an issue that our speakers will examine more closely this evening by discussing case studies from Mexico, Colombia, and Guatemala, as well as Zimbabwe. So far for now by me, I would now like to hand over to you, Wolfgang.
Yes, thank you very much for the introductory work, and a very welcome from my part to everybody who is here. And I have now the great pleasure to introduce to you Elisa Cruz Ureda from the Universidad Autónoma de Chiapas, and a few words on her CV. She holds a degree in law from the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico and a PhD in anthropology from the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana de Iztapalapa. And she is now full-time professor at the School of Indigenous Management and Self-Development and in the doctorate in regional studies of the Autonomous University of Chiapas. She has various publications on the topics of human rights, rights of indigenous people, and indigenous law. And her two latest books in Spanish are first, Autonomous Exercise from the Normative Systems, Protocols of Prior Consultation, Regulations, and Indigenous Communal Statutes, which appears now or has recently appeared in 2022. And from 2018, a second book, Indigenous Law, Legal Dynamics, Construction of Law and Dispute Processes. She will now talk to us, and you can see it here on the slide, about structural reform of the energy sector in Mexico, indigenous rights, human rights, and the project of the so-called Maya train. And it's a great pleasure that I can pass the word to you, Elisa. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. Energy reforms in Mexico, indigenous rights, human rights, and the mega project called Maya Train. More than 32 years after the adoption of the Convention 1669 of the International Labor Organization for indigenous and tribal peoples in independent countries, 26 years of the San Andres Accords, 21 years of the reforms to the Mexican constitutions in indigenous matters, and 11 years of the constitutional reforms of human rights, the United Mexican States, or Mexico, it has a vast corpus of human rights incorporated into its legal framework. However, paradoxically, today, there is a human rights crisis that marks one of the deepest civilizational crises that humanity has experienced and that has in COVID-19. This civilizational crisis is based on a structural violence of the economic model that falls directly on the world society and its different sectors: children, adolescents, older adults, men, women, indigenous, Afro-descendants, with a growing number of disappeared persons, feminicides, environment affection that promote climate change, longer drought, floods, and human displacement due to the change in the vocation of agriculture lands, given the implementation of extractive projects, clean energy, mining, transportation, communication routes. The case of the so-called Maya train, as well as the so-called clean energy, are promoted on the basis of inequality and structural violence, where the most vulnerable sector are left outside, or in this, the responsibility for the effect of the implementation of mega projects is deposited, especially when their failures are economic, social, and environmental. Here we have the context to government discourse that says itself popular but not break with the words of the past regimes. ICIR are human rights. That means environmental, social, cultural, and economic rights of social rights. We have different dimensions of the life to indigenous people that involve the world's sense of cosmovision, affected for mega projects like dams, but also that Maya trains, solar farms, etc. That dimension also are spaces for autonomy exercise. One worst practice from last government is in fact the manipulation of the indigenous image. But with the present government that is self-proclaimed different and progressive, it intends showing that manipulation as benevolent. It is represent new legal and fight challenge for the indigenous people and their organization. For example, use international mechanisms like Union National Organization Relator about indigenous people subject, or go to Human Rights High Commission Office. Since the beginning of his mandate, the Mexican president has approached businessmen, leaving aside indigenous people, social organizations, and academic researchers. This agreement is proof of that. We are not saying that it is wrong to approach businessmen, but an economic public policy that doesn't consider this sector will be repudiated, contradicted, and resisted by them in the territories where the company intend to work. Here we can see the social character of our political federal constitution as supreme law of the nation. But that social character was left precisely since 1990, when social property was put on the market with the 27 constitutional reforms. These are the characteristics of the agrarian law in Mexico, but each government that come to power changed the norms for the protection of social rights. This is why we now have few social protection standards. This social protection was finished in 1992 when the social property is put in the market, while before that counter-reform, the agrarian law was social protective peasant, collective owner, and rural workers. After it applied the private law, like the commerce law and the civil law. Here we have the date to counter-reform 2013. The counter-reformation of 2013 crowned the first counter-reform because it permits the temporal occupation without expropriation or economic compensation, and generate new normative like electricity in industry law and geothermal energy law. Here we see the location of the Yucatan Peninsula on the Mexico map. Also, we can see the interconnection electricity system, thermoelectricity, aeolic, and photovoltaic. We see on this map at the beginning of 2019 the different section of the train, but it is important to say that the mega project Maya train is a territorial reorder, not only real train that means change the agricultural soil use for real estate expansion use or massive touristic use, for example. And it may be that this is not worrying. The problem doesn't exist solid Western management plans, and the region is a large reservoir of fresh water that run the risk of being lost or contaminated by the works of the Maya train. We have other map of the same region. We can see the big city where we'll cross the train and the touristic development. The same map where we see the collective property, indigenous people and rural property. It calculates that the last ride will be Calakmul Reserve of the Biosphere. Here's the map to the Biosphere, Calakmul. Two cases were both wind power and the passage of the Maya train tracks, and the therefore massive tourist and real estate development are presented. Despite what is mean for the environment to generate clean energy, the process of signing contracts with the owners of the land and the consulting the residents in general has been irregular, rich, and in many cases not exist, violating the human right of the agrarian subject of the indigenous and their peoples. They are agrarian nuclei with a form of ejido social tenure that were established prior to the 1992 agrarian law. This change in the way of life that is from being peasant to proletariat working has been due precisely to the regulation or re-regulation of the Mexican state, and its economic policy was last priority is to promote agricultural production and much less food sovereignty, promoting the importation of grain, meat, and food in general. Conclusion. The right to consultation doesn't resolve the gaps or omission on inequality and structural violence that conditions indigenous, Afro-descended, and their people to real full exercise their rights to autonomy and self-determination. The violence has been expressed in the constant attempts of the different governments in Mexico to assimilate the indigenous people, integrate them into Mexican society, disregarding their ethnic, cultural, and historical origins. Violence has historically been expressed in the constant attempts of the different governments in Mexico to establish mechanisms that are not culturally appropriate and that don't not guarantee the free expression of the will of indigenous, Afro-descendants, their communities, and their peoples. Last, an attempt to address these gaps of inequality and structural violence was the process of dialogues between the Zapatista Army of National Liberation with the federal government and the state of Chiapas, which began from the so-called cathedral dialogues to the San Andres dialogues from 1994 to 1996. This resulted in the San Andres Accords, historical background of the reform to second article of the Federal Constitution. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Elisa. And we will have the discussion after the 3 talks, as we already announced. And then I have the pleasure to pass the word to my dear colleague Brigitte Ranwart to introduce our second speaker.
Yeah, thank you. So I would now like to introduce Dr. Joseph Mugere, who has completed his PhD in history at the University of Edinburgh in 2012. Dr. Mugere worked as a senior lecturer in the history department of the University of Zimbabwe, Harare, and has recently been appointed lecturer in history at the National University of Lesotho in Roma, Maseru. Dr. Mugere holds, apart from that, presently a senior postdoctoral fellowship in the Volkswagen Foundation's funding initiative, Africa Knowledge for Tomorrow, which is a postdoctoral program in the humanities in North and Sub-Saharan Africa. In this respect, he is also affiliated as a research fellow with the Department of Anthropology and Development Studies at the University of Johannesburg. His research focuses on issues of land, migration, the politics of belonging, small-scale and artisanal mining, and urban informality. In 2019, he published his monograph on Land, Migration and Belonging, a history of Basotho in Southern Rhodesia, 1890s to 1960s. This monograph has been published with James Curry. Being also interested in collaborative documentary filmmaking, he has recently directed his first documentary film, Waiting in the Platinum City, based on a former research project of Joseph on platinum mining in Rustenburg, South Africa. This is a 25 minutes production, which is available with Vimeo and, well, highly recommendable for viewing because Joseph Mugere here explores the concept of waiting, and it is in a fine, in a fine visual adaptation that this concept is explained here. Today, Joseph Mugere will discuss findings from his current research project on claim holders, tributors, and cooperatives, the political economy of artisanal and small-scale mining, small-scale, this time not platinum, but chromite mining in Zimbabwe. So you already see the title here on the slide. Please, Joseph, take the floor. You should unmute yourself, please.
Thank you very much for those kind words, Professor Reinwald. The title of my presentation is Local Communities, Chinese Mining Companies and the Dynamics of Artisanal and Small-Scale Chromite Mining in Mapanzure communal areas in Zimbabwe. As highlighted by Professor Reinwald, this is part of my larger project that focuses on small-scale, the political economy of small-scale and artisanal chromite mining in Zimbabwe from 1985. In this particular paper, I'm looking at the role of Chinese companies in the mechanization of artisanal and small-scale chromite mining in Zimbabwe in the post-2000 fast-track land reform program period. In particular, I'm looking at the effects of the introduction of heavy mining machinery, such as excavators and haulage trucks on artisanal mining in these rural communities, especially on environmental, on its effects on the environment. I'm also looking at the effects of Chinese companies' mining and equipment hire contracts, as well as their chromite ore buying practices on these rural communities, both positive and negative effects. And finally, in the last section of my presentation, I'll discuss community protests against Chinese mining practices, as well as local communities' loss of arable land, as well as their grievances against the environmental impacts of chromite mining in these areas. So just to provide you with a brief background of chromite mining or small-scale chromite mining in Zimbabwe since 1985. At independence, chromite mining was dominated by two multinational corporations, that is Anglo-American Corporation, that later became Zim Alloys, as well as Union Carbide, whose local subsidiary was Zimasco. So this monopoly by the two transnational corporations unsettled the newly established government, which was against the domination of these multinational corporations. And in 1985, due to the fact that there was a slump in global prices for base minerals, especially chromite, there were intense discussions between these multinational corporations and the government over the retrenchment of workers by these companies, which felt that because of the low global global prices for chrome mining was becoming unsustainable, and that they had to retrench their workers. And this is happening at a time when the newly installed independent government was against retrenchment and was characterizing itself as a pro-worker regime. So these discussions later led to a compromise between the government and the transnational corporations, where these transnational corporations were allowed to retrench workers, but on condition that they would then avail their marginal claims, which they would allow the retrenched workers to exploit as cooperatives. And these retrenched workers would work in a system which was called a tribute mining system, where the cooperatives would mine on the claims belonging to the transnational corporations and then sell the chrome to the transnational corporations, of course, at the prices determined by the transnational corporations. So the transnational corporations in this kind of arrangement were called the grantors, and they would provide loans, fuel, technical support, as well as equipment, whilst the retrenchees who had now formed cooperatives were the tributors. Now I'll move on to chrome mining in Mapanzure communal areas. Chrome mining in Mapanzure communal areas since the 1990s was largely dominated by mining cooperatives, which had been established in the 1980s. But I must highlight the fact that these cooperatives were established in another area to the north of the Great Dyke. But then in the 1990s, you begin to see these cooperatives moving south to this area, which I had provided a map. So amongst the most popular chrome mining cooperatives were Ingezi Chrome Mining Cooperative, Makomborero Mining Cooperatives, among others. And all these cooperatives worked as tributes to Zim Alloys and Zimasco, the two transnational corporations. But then when we get to the year 2000, there was a revolutionary land reform program, which was called the Fast Track Land Reform Program, where war veterans and landless peasants started to invade commercial farms, which were owned by white farmers. And they did this with the support of the ruling party, ZANU-PF. And it caused massive displacement and redistribution of land. And this land reform program provided a new impetus for the upsurge in artisanal and small-scale mining among its villagers, who took this as an opportunity to also invade mine claims owned by transnational corporations and begin also to mine. So the invasion and illegal mining of chromite claims belonging to the transnational corporations was locally referred to as kubomba, or literally bombing. So villagers took this as an opportunity to also get their hands on claims that had been owned or that belonged to transnational corporations since the 1980s. But they also faced another struggle of where to sell the chrome that they had illegally mined. And this is where the Chinese mining companies then come in. The Chinese mining companies began to seize this opportunity of a gap where they saw villagers mining chrome, but not being able to sell the chrome to the two transnational corporations. And they started to set up camps where they would buy chrome of different qualities from these villagers, which led to another upsurge in artisanal and small-scale chrome mining in these rural communities. And this was also aided by the sanctions that had been imposed on the Zimbabwean government due to the land reform program. These sanctions were imposed by the United Kingdom, the EU, as well as the United States of America. And the government responded to this by coming up with a new foreign policy, which they titled the Look East policy, in which the government decided that if the Western governments have looked away from us, the only solution is to look east. That is to privilege companies and governments from Asia, and also give them deals to, especially to get access to mineral resources. So because of this Look East policy, we begin to see a large number of Chinese mining companies getting into the country, getting claims, some of them, but mostly you find them being involved in mining contracts as well as buying chrome from artisanal and small-scale miners. So in Mapanzure, the most popular Chinese mining companies include Afrochin, Asia Ferry, among others, several smaller companies and individuals. And my argument is that these Chinese companies changed the chromite mining environment by buying a wide range of chrome grades, which include chrome fines, which traditional mining companies were actually not buying or were rejecting. They also introduced a new system where they bought chromite ore on a cash on delivery basis, whilst traditional companies paid 2 weeks or even a month after deliveries. So there were some positives, according to the local communities, that came with the involvement of a new player in the form of Chinese mining companies and individuals. But then there were also some challenges, because Chinese mining companies also came up with their own mining contracts. One of them being that they would approach a local cooperative or an individual with an access to a claim, and then they would get into a contract where they would mine on behalf of that cooperative or individual. But at the end of the day, they would collect 80% of the total tonnage and pay the claim owner an equivalent of 20% of the value of the total tonnage. Initially, they were using a 70% to 30% arrangement, but later on, they began to use an 80% to 20% arrangement, which local communities found to be very exploitative, especially because the other option that was available to them was to hire excavators on their own, which cost around $120 per hour. That is a dry rate, which most of them could not afford. Another grievance relates to the low prices at which these Chinese mining companies bought the chrome. Initially, in the early 2000s and late 90s, chrome was being bought at as high as $120 per ton. But in the post-2000 period, especially with the Chinese buyers, they would buy Lambi chrome for between $35 to $55 per ton. But because they usually ended into verbal agreements, these Chinese mining companies, sometimes they would change the contract and buy the chrome at a much lower price once you deliver the chrome to their yard. Another issue is that the Chinese mining companies also introduced heavy mining equipment, which to a mining community is it actually damages the environment much quicker than artisanal mining, where miners would use picks and shovels. And this led to a number of grievances amongst members of these communities. I'll cite just 2 interviews here. This is an interview that I did with Martha Moyo on 10 November 2020. She was complaining about the mining practices of the Chinese. The company could make verbal agreements with a cooperative that it would buy their ore at $50 per ton before commencing the mining process, and then change the amount to $35 per ton, citing contentious reasons such as poor quality of ore or fluctuating global chromite practices, among other reasons. Some also complained about the 80-20 mining contract arrangement, among others. And over and above that, local communities also complained about how the Chinese companies' use of heavy mining equipment led to massive environmental degradation and noise pollution. They also complained that the Chinese mining companies were mining with total disregard to infrastructure such as roads and railway lines. I think on to the left, you can see a photograph of someone who is mining just a few meters from a railway line. And all these grievances, they sometimes end up in newspapers. For instance, this newspaper from 2016, the title is Mapanzole Community BS Brand of Mining. And in this article, the reporter talks about how the Chinese mining companies leave huge pits open, which causes a lot of problems, especially to livestock that fall in those pits. And then there are also stories of tensions between Chinese mining companies and local members of the local community. Sometimes there are actually community protests against Chinese companies, with the major grievance being that they leave the pits open, and also that they do not come up with any corporate social responsibility programs for the community. So there have been a number of community protests against these Chinese mining companies. And in most cases, these local community protests are led by either the local councillor or traditional leaders. And one of the major complaints is against the use of heavy mining equipment, especially close to homesteads and schools, as well as the Chinese mining practice of just using verbal contracts instead of written contracts, and also the fact that they are not plowing back to the local community. So in conclusion, my argument really is that Chinese mining companies' participation in artisanal and small-scale chromite mining has led to an increased mechanization of artisanal mining, as well as environmental degradation. And also that mining operations, they're leaving huge pits and block rivers, damage infrastructures such as roads, railways, schools, among others. In addition, there's also an exploitation of local miners and claim holders through verbal mining contracts and low prices for their ore. And there's also a huge reluctance amongst these Chinese mining companies to implement meaningful corporate social responsibility programs in the community. And this usually leads to intermittent grassroots protests to force Chinese companies to address these grievances by the local communities. But because of the government's Look East policy and their general argument that because of the sanctions, the Chinese and other Eastern Asian countries are the only ones that are supporting them, and therefore the government is supporting these Chinese companies against the local communities. It has led to a situation whereby even though these locals protest against Chinese companies, very little is being done to alleviate their suffering and to address their grievances. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for this instructive talk and this perfect timekeeping. Thank you very much. And well, as with Elisa's talk, we will have the questions and discussion afterwards, after Philipp Nauke's presentation.
Thank you. Well, I don't have question. I so shocked, no, because what Joseph present is a scene of what we call a structural violence. That is as the exploitation of a country and its people is legalized, therefore violence is normalized. It's really, really, I'm really sad, no? And also I'm really angry, no? Because that is really impressive, no? I have a question, Joseph. What is the framework, legal framework? How is the normative to permit this mining Chinese to do that? No, that is my only question. Thank you very much for your presentation. Really touched my heart.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I guess, Joseph, that you just took note of Elisa's question, and then you could answer in the discussion section.
Yes, I've taken note of the question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I hand over to Wolfgang again.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we will have the discussion after the third talk. And so now I have the pleasure to present to you Philipp Nauke from Philipps University at Marburg in Germany. Philipp holds a PhD in anthropology. He got it also from the Philipps University. And he's currently a postdoc in a research project entitled Competing Insecurities, Frictions of Violence, Transformation and Peace Building in Colombia. So closely related to the topic of this talk today. And he's also a lecturer in social and cultural anthropology at Philipps University Marburg. His research and teaching interests are the anthropology of peace, conflict and security, political anthropology, the anthropology of the state, and the anthropology of violence, as well as resistance and memory. Just to cite two of his recent publications, in 2020 appeared, that's a German title, Klientelisierte Staatlichkeit in Konfliktregionen, eine Ethnographie der Begegnung einer kolumbianischen Friedensgemeinde mit staatlichen Institutionen. That's a book, and so clientelist state in conflict regions, one could translate it roughly. And the second publication is a special issue of the journal Social Anthropology, and the special issue is devoted to the topic peace building and conceptualizations of the local. And so today, as you can see here in the slide, Philipp will talk about conflict transformation despite para-state violence, peasant peace building in Latin America, with a special reference to Colombia and Guatemala. So the floor is yours, Philipp. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Well, thanks a lot, Wolfgang Gerbert, for this kind introduction, and of course to Brigitte Reinwald and Wolfgang Gerbert for organizing and inviting to this panel. As the title of my presentation already suggests, I want to make 3 points in this paper. First, I would like to describe some characteristics of parastate violence in Latin America. Second, present rural communities suffering parastate violence in Colombia and Guatemala. And third, analyze their potential to transform violent conflicts peacefully. Despite the short presentation time, I will begin by describing a brief episode from the recent history of one of the communities I work with, which might give something like an ethnographic preview of the points I subsequently elaborate. This episode began on December 29 in 2017, when 4 paramilitaries armed with German-made 6-hour gun and wearing dark, long-sleeved hoodies tried to enter a house in the peace community of San José de Apartado in Colombia. Several community members were in the house, including its legal spokesperson, the man you see in the picture. In the attempt to gain access to the house, some community members confronted the gunmen, managing to take the gun away and detain 2 of them. Due to the lack of trust, the community did not hand over the 2 paramilitaries to the local police or prosecutor's office, but asked national institutions, including the President's Office and the Ministry of Interior, to receive them. 24 hours later, a delegation composed of Colombia's Vice Minister of Interior, officials of the Ombudsman's Office, and a bishop arrived in San José de Apartado and received the 2 detainees. The delegation handed them over to the local prosecutor's office, which brought them before a judge who set the 2 paramilitaries free a couple of hours later. As stated in the news program Noticias Uno on January 8, 2018, the judge justified the release by arguing that the fundamental rights of the aggressors had been violated during their detention because the 2 were unable to make phone calls. Before being released, the 2 paramilitaries filed charges against the peace community for kidnapping and illegal detention. That same day, Luis Perez, the then governor of the department where the peace community is located, presented the official interpretation of the incident at a press conference that was also shown on national television. He said, quote, "These guys were no paramilitaries at all. They were a couple of dudes from the same community, one of them the hairdresser, who put on hoodies to rob a store." End of quote. On January 31, 2018, the community destroyed the 6-hour gun during the visit of the National Ombudsman, the man with a white hat in the middle. Under blue skies, surrounded by community members and under the watchful eye of the Ombudsman, a peasant knelt in front of a river stone on which he passionately smashed the gun with a simple carpenter's hammer. This 1 month episode is on the one hand the story of the peace community of San José de Apartado in a nutshell. Summarized, this story is about a community of peasants who resist the dynamics of political violence, about armed groups who persecute them, about public forces who do not guarantee their security, about legal authorities who act inconsistently without sanctioning most of the crimes, and about politicians who question the credibility of this community or make fun of it. At the end, it is the community itself that takes concrete steps to transform the dynamics of violence. For this paper, this episode allows me to formulate 3 questions that I would like to address in the remaining time. First, what does parastate violence mean in Latin America? Second, how do rural communities in Colombia and Guatemala act in face of parastate violence? And third, how do these communities transform conflict and constitute peace-building processes on its own? Starting with the first question, one can describe parastate violence in several ways. The most obvious way is to consider the relations between paramilitaries and state institutions in the exercise of political violence. Here, we could distinguish between paramilitary acts of violence that are not prevented or prosecuted by state institutions, as shown in the vignette above. between paramilitary acts of violence supported by state institutions through the providing of informations, logistics, and weapons, and between acts of violence committed jointly by paramilitaries and public forces, which in the case of the community mentioned, included multiple massacres, disappearances, displacements. These different relations imply obviously different degrees of responsibility and accountability of state institutions. However, one can also describe parastate violence in terms of its social cultural dimensions, contexts, and effects, as done by different anthropologists like Michael Tausig in the case of Colombia, or Linda Green in the case of Guatemala. For example, in some cases, parastate violence aims to destroy political organizations by murdering their most visible leaders, what might have been the goal of the paramilitaries in the vignette. This assumes that in an organization whose leaders has been murdered, no one will take over the leadership due to the risk to life involved. Killing leaders has in many cases been sufficient to destroy entire social organizations in Latin America. In other cases, parastate violence aims to destroy social cultural structures like entire villages or neighborhoods. To this end, violence is staged in public spaces. In front of the entire community, residents are randomly selected and murdered. This public violence targets the social function of communal life, leads to a retreat into the private sphere, and increases distrust between neighbors. Public events, church visits, festivals come to an end and community structures atomize. Villages that have been hit by such violence often lose their function of social integration, with the consequences of individual displacement. What I find particularly striking in these cases, and what also was shown in the vignette above, is the public narrative that underlies this violence. That in my view constitutes an essential feature of parastate violence. Some state officials, prosecutors, judges, and politicians are engaged in a set of practices and discourses that normalizes, legitimize, and thereby enable parastate violence. The above mentioned relations between paramilitaries and state institutions do not necessarily have to exist to be able to speak of parastate violence. In public atmosphere that denies the credibility of the victims, stigmatizes and marginalizes them, that sometimes turns the victims into perpetrators, as we have also seen in the vignette, and which is deliberately nurtured by state officials and institutions, seems to be the basis for parastate violence, at least in Colombia and in Guatemala, but maybe in whole Latin America. So how do rural communities in Colombia and Guatemala act in the face of parastate violence? Just to give some background information, I work with 2 rural communities in Colombia and Guatemala where I conducted repeated field work in the last 2 decades, which were usually part of EFD-founded research projects. One of them is the already mentioned peace community of San Jose de Apartado, which is located, as you can see here in the map, in the northwestern Colombia. In this region, different groups have been present since the 1960s. Parastate violence escalated in the mid-1990s as paramilitary groups and public forces tried to take control of the area. In this context, the village of San Jose de Apartado declared itself a peace community in 1997, which means that residents commit not to support any armed actors in any way, while demanding that all armed actors respect their rights as civilians. The other is the community of population in resistance of the Ixcan area, which is located in north-central Guatemala. You see the map here in the middle. This region became a guerrilla retreat in the 1970s and saw multiple massacres and displacement of several 10,000 people in the early 1980s when public forces launched multiple attacks on the region. With these raids, the communities of population in resistance emerged in 1982. A network of small groups that lived quasi-nomadic in the rainforest for more than 10 years and secured their survival through an incredible ability of cooperation and adaptation to the environmental conditions. The fact that rural communities are more or less successfully resisting the dynamics of political violence and armed conflict seems unusual, which begs the question why and how they do it. Before going into detail, it is important to note that both are relatively small communities between 1,000 and 2,000 residents, and that both, as peasants in one case and as indigenous people in the other, share a special relationship to what they consider their land. With regard to their formations, it is remarkable that the residents only settled in their respective areas in the 1960s, namely because they were displaced from other parts of their countries as poor landless or driven out by violent conflicts. The residents of both communities were already aware of the consequences of political violence from their own experience in the past, which includes displacement, loss of land and property, destruction of community and family life. In addition, before the escalation of violence, the residents of both communities were involved in different political and economic organizations, such as cooperatives, community councils, but also political parties. Furthermore, when the violence escalated, the residents could count on the solidarity of third parties, such as church and international NGOs, who supported these communities in their search for alternative forms of living in the midst of violent conflict. So in addition to many differences between these two communities, the special relationship to land, the experience of displacement, the ability to organize politically, and the solidary support of third parties are factors that both communities share. With regard to the persistence of these communities, it is striking that their residents, firstly, have strong visions of living together in their respective communities, that is, shared experiences, values, and ideas of how, for example, a dignified peasant existence should look like. Secondly, the political and economical organization of these communities not only show continuity with the organizations that existed before the violence, but also demands and promotes the participation of all residents. For example, in rotating logics, leadership positions are regularly occupied by different people in order not to permanently expose individual leaders to the danger of persecution or to make the existence of the whole community dependent on some individuals. Thirdly, both communities have in common that they changed their way of subsistence with the escalation of violence. Whereas previously the peasant family was both the production and the consumption unit of their subsistence economy, both communities collectivized and diversified agricultural production, thereby strengthening their solidarity between the residents and protecting the agricultural fields and products from destruction by armed actors. Fourth, another protection strategy of both communities, although differently developed, is their mobility. The indigenous people in Guatemala lived quasi-nomadic in temporary camps, which they were able to dismantle and move within a question of hours. The peasants in Colombia live scattered in small hamlets, which they temporarily leave when the presence of armed actors and actions increases, and to which they return when the situations permit. A final aspect both communities have in common is the ability to generate international solidarity in the form of human rights monitoring, trade relations, urgent actions, and so on. By doing so, how do these communities transform conflict and constitute peace-building processes on its own? I would say that these strategies presented here change the conditions of armed conflicts, which are usually defined by the armed actors. In this sense, conflict transformation can be observed on at least 3 levels. Regarding the conflict dynamics, the actions of armed actors are directly influenced by the presence of these communities. To give just one example, the mobility strategies mentioned, such as leaving and moving back to a hamlet, contest the control of armed actors in areas of conflict. And this is not only about the physical occupation of spaces of conflict, it is foremost about a symbolic appropriation and reinscription of peasant or indigenous ways of life in these conflicting spaces. Second, Regarding conflict causes, the internal organization of these communities counteract local and regional causes of conflict. Again, just one example. Just some examples. In their communities, peasants and indigenous people experience a political participation from which they are excluded in regional and national political contexts. Common land ownership makes a contested resource of land accessible to all residents, and solidary trade alliances guarantee fair financial income for the whole community. Regarding symbolic conflict orders, these communities subvert, in a certain sense, the social cultural construction of the conflict and the symbolic order of the armed actors. By not supporting them, the residents deny their legitimacy and adopt a more or less autonomous position. Such a position should not exist from the perspectives of armed actors, since it does not only question the existing friend-foe dichotomy, but also the plausibility of this dichotomy. The no collaboration breaks up the binary opposition of the conflict constellation and undermines the social order and the ordering principles of armed groups. These communities appear to have developed specific social cultural strategies and practices to address the causes and dynamics of conflict in their particular regions, transforming violent relationships between armed actors and civilian residents. This all is the more astonishing because the legal and illegal armed groups do not respect these communities, but persecute, threaten, and even murder their inhabitants. To come to an end, I will just give a quick outlook on the current situation of both communities. Both communities formerly live in post-conflict situations, but in both regions, parastate actors are still active. So it seems that parastate violence does not end with formal peace agreements. Parastate violence is not just a phenomenon in times of conflict, but a political strategy in times of peace as well. At the same time, institutional support for both communities is minimal to non-existent. For security issues, economic subsistence, dignified life, and so on. In this post-conflict situation, both communities, as before in the conflict situation, are primarily dependent on their own agency, creativity, and resilience. Many thanks for your attention. I'm looking forward to comments, questions, critique.
Yeah, thank you very much, Philip, for your interesting talk, which adds a new, some new aspects to our discussion. With much more direct violence, we were concerned more with forms of structural violence, as far as I got the talks of the other colleagues. And so we can now come to the discussion. And I can pass the word to Brigitte, who has followed the questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Philipp Nauke, for your talk as well. And well, I have been collecting questions, and there are lots of them. So we would perhaps make a first round. And then because there are still questions coming in, and then look for a second round of discussion. We have enough time. This is very good. And so I have well, and this goes for all speakers. There is a big applause in the live stream. They all thank you very much for your talks. So I don't repeat this with every question. I'm now forwarding to you. Yeah, there are a bunch of questions to Elisa first. The first one is, in how far can international organizations actually have an impact on local lawmaking processes? And combined to that, what are the limits of influence of these organizations regarding indigenous people and the Maya train?
Okay, thank you. Can I answer?
Yeah, well, let's do it like that. And then I just give you the next one, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Well, First, the international organisms have an impact because, for example, at the last consultation, the government make the international relators of the United Nations have an important intervention because say that is not consultation, that say the relators to national organization, no? They say to the government, to the Mexican government, you are wrong. That is not consultation conform to the Convention 169. We know the international organization to the internal process is very limited because only can interview when the government invite them, no? And this expression to say to Mexican government, you are wrong, is real, how do you say, support to the fight for human rights to the indigenous people. I think that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you yourself mentioned, this Convention 169, there are also two questions on that. And the first one is, how is the actual situation with the implementation of this convention after a lot of critiques was sent to the government? That is the first half. And then this Convention 169 relating to the German government this time. And the question is concerning the ratification of the German government of this Convention 169. What are the responsibilities of German enterprises, such as the German Railway, which is who is one of the investors in the Maya train project?
Well, the second question is very difficult.
I guess so.
I can enter it to Germany the next year. Well, it's difficult because it's a sovereignty to the each state, to the each country, no? But I think it's a really responsibility to the German government to ratify or signing this convention because it's a human right international normative, no? For example, right now, this convention helped to indigenous people in Mexico to protect them, no? But in other time, maybe used for the people in Germany to defend on rights, on human rights, no? For that, I think it's no problem to sign this convention, no? Dependent. And for the first question, is very problematic to accept the International Labor Organization because it's so late, no? If you have a reclamation right now, maybe 10 years late, you have a resolution, no? Because it's very problematic. But the people, indigenous people, Afro-descendant people, have the instrument to fight for our territories and for our human rights. This instrument so important for us.
Mhm. Thank you. And now a third complex of questions, if you like, concerns the dilemma of having a leftist government confronted with and in contradiction with the Maya Train project and the violating of indigenous and human rights. Could you explain a bit more how this is considered by the local population?
Well, yes, the audience, no, the people in Mexico, we are divided, no, because some part say Mexican president have all the reasons, no, and the other part we vote for this president, say maybe, but this president violate human rights, violate the framework, the rights we have on federal constitutions, no? And the other part don't say that, no? The other part of the population, to the audience, say, what's matter, no? No worry. It's fine to violate that framework to right, because our president do that for our benefit, no? But we, the other part, we don't accept that, no? We know that this framework to human rights is only we have to defend it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Elisa. I now turn over to Joseph. Joseph, you had a first question by Elisa, and perhaps I put a second one, which has been asked whether the Chinese government had ever experienced some sort of sanctions due to its company's activities in Zimbabwe. And at the same time, are there any international efforts to support growing protests of local small-scale miners?
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Reinwald. I'll start with the question by Elisa, referring to whether there is any legal framework that can be used to assist these local communities in their fights against Chinese mining companies. Indeed, there are mining laws which are quite strong, I think. But the challenge is with the political will of the government to implement those laws. For instance, any mining company, before they start mining, they have to carry out an environmental impact assessment to see whether their mining activity will not lead to any serious environmental damage. Will it affect rivers? Would it affect arable land, etc., etc.? And they all do that. They are also supposed to consult local communities. But in the end, they just consult just a few people that they pay and who then endorse their environmental impact assessment reports or their cultural or heritage impact assessment reports. So it has to do largely with the lack of political will to implement that. The second issue relates to the rehabilitation of the environment post-mining. And again, there's a law that states that before any mining company embarks on any mining activity, they should have a plan on how to rehabilitate the environment after the mineral is exhausted. And they usually submit those plans. But again, because of lack of political will, at the end of the day, they just mine and then abandon the place with all those pits and unrehabilitated land. And then to Professor Renaud, the first one with regards to whether the international community has put any sanctions against the Chinese government because of its bad mining, Chinese companies' bad mining practices. I haven't encountered any such, but I'll continue to explore. This is a paper that is still at its formative stage, but it's something that I'll be willing to explore further and see if there is a reaction from the international community against bad mining practices, especially by Chinese mining companies. And the second one related to whether there's international support for local protests against Chinese mining companies. I'm not sure of any, but what I could highlight is that there's a local NGO, non-governmental organization called the Zimbabwe Environmental Lawyers Association. This is an NGO that has been working very closely with these mining communities and trying to conscientize them about their rights and also to help them articulate their grievances and sometimes taking some miners to court on behalf of the local communities. But of course, I want to believe that it's also a non-governmental organization that is also receiving support from the international community. That's what I can say for now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. There was a question popping up quite just now, where it is asked whether neighboring countries are possibly involved in support. I could add, we have examples from Zambia when under Chinese, when Chinese companies reopened the old copper mines, and we had those grievances and protests as well. Is there any hint of how to say transnational protests?
Thank you for that question. At present, there is no international. These grassroots protests are quite intermittent and not really well organized. Usually, they rally behind a local councillor or a local traditional leader. They are not quite well structured to have international solidarities with other mining communities, say in South Africa or in Zambia. And this is largely because this is happening at a very informal level. These are small scale and artisanal miners who are working with Chinese companies, which are also very small and largely informal, working with verbal contracts rather than any written contracts. So it's a very fluid environment, which is very local and not yet quite international in outlook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And now to switch to Zimbabwean government, there has been a question why Zimbabwean government is so weak in supporting their own people, in this case, small-scale miners. And well, followed by the question, what are the interests of government towards Chinese companies?
Okay, thank you very much. I think this is quite historical. It is precisely because in the year 2000, Zimbabwean government allowed war veterans and landless peasants to invade farms that were owned by white commercial farmers. And this is a very historical land question issue, land issues that had not been resolved at independence. And in 2000, there was that outburst of anger among us war veterans and landless peasants, who then invaded white-owned farms and displaced them. And the international community, especially the Western governments, the EU, the UK, as well as the United States of America, then imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe was almost like a pariah state because it couldn't trade, it couldn't do a lot of things with the Western governments. So it turned to the East, and especially to China with its Look East policy. So the Chinese government and Chinese companies began to have privileges when they wanted to do any investments in Zimbabwe. And this, what we see now with the local grievances and protests against Chinese companies, these are residual effects of Zimbabwean government turning to the East and turning to the Chinese. And now, even if the local communities are being exploited by these Chinese mining companies and individuals, the government does very little because it is still receiving loans and a lot of political and economic support from the Chinese government. So this is a political economy issue and an international relations issue.
That's right. Yes. Well, let us keep us like that. I have a second round of questions to you as well, but I would now address Philipp Nauke. There has been a question of if you could give some ideas about past experiences with armed conflicts of both communities or within both communities, and in how far do their past common experiences influence their present strategies?
Thanks a lot for the question. So past experiences with violence in both communities. Well, both communities were when they settled in their respective regions, were actually displaced from other places of their country. And that was usually violent processes by which that happened. So what goes with that is that they already experienced what it means to leave a village structure, to leave the family behind, to leave the own property, the agricultural fields, and all these aspects of daily life, and to come to a new place and to have to start from zero again. When they came to this, and that's actually the case for both communities, when they came to the new places, it was, in the case of Guatemala, like an organized process of settling an area that was led by an American missionary, how do you say that, a missionary group. And they implemented a policy of organizing the people in cooperatives. So they actually trained the people in Guatemala in self-administrating, in self-organizing, and in like how to lead economic political organizations like a cooperative. And it's quite interesting that the organizational structures that they established when the violence escalated are pretty similar to the organigram, you can say, of the cooperatives before. So there was an internal council, the way how these people in the internal council were elected were all like parts which they just transformed or adapted into the new situation. The same with the community or not the same, something similar in the community in Colombia. There it was also a cooperative, but also a political party that was active in this area. And a lot of peasants before the 1990s were actually, well, some of them were made part of this political party, the Union Patriotica, a left-wing party. Some of them were elected councils in the next municipal town, and others were also organized in this cooperative. And here again, like you almost can see that the political organization of the peace community in the present, with an internal council, with different committees organizing different aspects of daily life, it's almost identical with the form of organizing them before in the cooperatives. So that's like examples for the continuities that you can see. But of course, well, also adapting it, to the new situation, there were a lot of forms of organizing them, which they had to invent it, which they actually learned from third parties, from international organizations that actually introduced ideas about human rights and international humanitarian law, in which they, like in a process of vernacularization, adapted to the local realities, and where they actually connected from past experience. To give another example, for example, the way to work in working groups to collectivize the agricultural production, that's actually in like almost in a tradition by Colombian peasants when they settle and cultivate a new region. So that was always something done in community. There was not just one family going to a place and starting like a new agricultural field, but there were always like several families working in working groups together and cultivate new land. So before it was called like mancomunados and stuff like that, and that actually they transformed and adapted to the new reality. And yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. And I have a follow-up question, which might be put or which might be asked to all three of you. Perhaps let us start with you, Philip. The question, are there any gender-specific strategies against the violence of paramilitary forces and for regaining peace? And well, after you have answered, I also ask this question adapted to Joseph and Elisa.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's actually a good question to show that there's no reason to romanticize these communities, you know. So I was like speaking in a collective singular, describing these communities as something like pretty united, and that's actually not the case. It's a community like every community in the world. There are a lot of problems and conflicts also in the community and with between the people. And I guess what is the difference there is that they, despite this inner conflicts, they stay together and they are able to be united in spite of these differences. And one point is that like this gender dimension, well, it's a rural community in Colombia, which is a pretty machistic one, male-dominated, that you can see in the political organization of these communities. That it's the majority some men who actually assume leading responsibilities, stuff like that. That's not to say that there are no women involved in it, but it's still like a huge issue in regard to gender equality. And in part, well, they're conscious of the problem, or it is an issue, at least in discussions, like it's coming up, it is seen, and it is perceived as something, yeah, they might want to work on, but yeah, the state of the art is pretty, in this regard, pretty yeah, typical for rural areas in Latin America, I guess.
Mhm. Thank you very much. Elisa would like to react, and perhaps I might add a question to you as well regarding gender relations. Could you perhaps explain if yes, in what way gender relations are impacted by the Maya Train project or these mega projects which are implemented in the region? And on the other hand, are there a way of gender-specific reactions, protests to such projects? Elisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, with many researchers show how Maya Train take more problems, for example, to person traffic, to narco traffic, and several subjects like that, no? And when Philip presented the Central America situation and Latin America situation, I think he showed the different waves of violence that have effect in Central and Latin America. And it's saying that, right, that's ending or the main thing or less that violence, they have increased, no? And the violence is more crude. I think that is more crude, no? The increases in people training to get to United States via Mexico show that, but also the way our countries treat them. Yes, it's very happy no, to know the organization of cooperative, but the monster is more big. I think that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and now to you, Joseph. There was explicitly a question on the social impact of the recent mining practices in Zimbabwe, namely, have existing economic inequalities worsened by this change of companies, if I may say so? And does this, and if yes, how does it affect gender relations?
That's a very difficult one, but I'll try. Yes, the entry of Chinese companies in chromite mining definitely changed the economic relations between large-scale mining companies and artisanal miners, as well as small-scale miners, because they brought in a new regime. For instance, whilst in the past, Zimasco and Zim Alloys would pay for chrome deliveries, perhaps sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes a month after delivery, which most artisanal and small-scale mining companies mining communities found to be quite exploitative and unfair. When the Chinese companies came in, they started paying for deliveries, usually on cash on delivery basis, but others would pay on the same week that they received a delivery, which local communities found to be quite helpful, because it meant that they had money to spend on a daily basis compared to the past. Then secondly, I want to talk a bit about the gender relations and how they've been affected by the Chinese mining companies' mining regimes. The first one I want to talk about is the mining contracts. From the fieldwork that I've done so far, I've discovered that most of the cooperatives that engage in these mining contracts with the Chinese are actually cooperatives that are run by women. And it is precisely because chrome mining is quite labor intensive. And in most cases, they say it's a masculine job. I mean, women can do gold mining and other things, but chrome is heavy. It's something that is sold in tonnages. So it's not suitable for women. So in this regard, you find that women with claims, especially cooperatives, they end up entering into these mining contracts with the Chinese companies, and then get also exploited by these Chinese companies because the contracts are verbal. Secondly, I think I showed some photographs of women in my slides. Mm-hmm. Those women are involved in what is called dump skating, where they would be searching for tiny little bits of stones with chrome, right? And they are regarded as chrome fines. They are not lambi chrome, but they're fines. And the Chinese companies usually buy that chrome for $5 per ton, which is massively exploitative. Very few men are involved in that, but it's mostly women because chrome mining is labor intensive. So at the end of the day, they end up doing that. Sometimes some would say they get paid $3 per ton, and you need perhaps a day or two to get a ton of chrome from those dumps. So there are some positives that have come with the involvement of Chinese mining companies, which is the availability of cash and the speed at which Chinese companies pay for deliveries. But again, this has also come with exploitation because they get paid very low prices for their chrome. So I hope I've made an attempt to address the two questions.
Thank you. Perhaps this is a good occasion to add another questions which went a bit more into the actual situation, because it was asked whether the communities in Zimbabwe have any advantage of the current rise of mineral prices because of the pandemic and the war. In the war, I guess it was meant the war between Russia and Ukraine. And this is the second sentence, are rising food prices more important? I would then add, are there any negotiation forces of the local miners towards the Chinese companies, as you explained that they practice rather slump prices per ton?
Okay, thank you very much for those three questions. Are there any advantages that are accruing to the local mining communities due to the rise in mineral prices? Very, very limited. At its height, I think in the 90s, late 90s, I think chrome from Zimbabwe was being bought at around $150 per ton. But over the years, I've never had someone who has sold their chrome for more than $65 per ton. So these Chinese companies, most of them are actually, they're not involved in mining, but they're middlemen. So they buy chrome from local communities in order to make a profit at the international market. So they always leverage their position to make sure that they benefit more than the local communities. Yes, at the moment, the rise in food prices is more important and is the major impact of the war. I mean, for the local communities, they associate this with that. And whether there's any negotiation at the local level, yes, because these contracts are verbal. Some people then develop relationships. Working relationships with these Chinese companies, And once they get into those relationships, they then get their chrome bought at much higher prices than the rest of the people in the community.
Mhm.
And then once someone realizes that so-and-so is getting his chrome being bought at, say, $55 and mine is being bought at $35, what they do then is then they ask that colleague or that fellow villager to sell the chrome on their behalf, of course, for some negotiated price. And then I think in one of the photographs, I showed two trucks, one very small truck and the other one a big truck. Usually when Chinese companies buy chrome, they want to buy for a full load. A full load is 30 tons, right? So when you are selling 30 tons, then you're likely to get the best price. But when you are hard pressed for cash and you want to sell just 5 tons, they will send that small truck. And once they send the small truck, you know that your price will be very low. So usually locals, then they pull together their chrome so that they can fill up the 30-ton truck so that they can get a much higher price. So there's a lot of negotiation and chicanery that happens. Of course, the locals also, they dupe the Chinese buyers as well. Sometimes they mix chrome with rubble and pass it on as chrome. So it goes both ways sometimes.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. I thought, well, for a final round of discussion, perhaps you feel in the mood of reacting to one another, and my co-chair has perhaps some questions or comments as well. And well, to our auditorium, you might perhaps have other questions now upon this this discussion. So you have a last chance to ask your questions, and then we will see how we wrap it up, as it is usually called. Yeah, so I'm going to collect more questions, and well, I give you the floor. Whoever feels in the mood of reacting, please do so. Wolfgang, please.
Yeah, just a few remarks. So first of all, thank you very much for all these interesting questions. I have one particular question to Elisa. We heard a lot of, we had got a lot of information from Joseph and from Philip about the very concrete situation in their regions and in the communities. And I would be interested, could you give a few more details on how the concrete project of the Maya train is affecting the life in the communities? For we know Yucatan has a long history of tourism, and we have many people from peasant communities working in the tourist business since decades. So what are the concrete changes that come up with a Maya train? I see an interesting parallel in all the talks that we have strong laws in all the countries, in Colombia and in Mexico and in Zimbabwe, but we have very weak political practices in spite of progressive governments. And that might be a question to particularly interesting for Philip. There's a slight chance that we will get a progressive candidate for president in Colombia soon. Might be. So these are my questions at the moment. Thank you very much. I don't know who will start with. Elisa, would you like to start with a concrete issue?
Well, the concrete impact to the population in the about the Maya train. Well, the ecological impact, because to building the Maya train, you have the forest, no, the way to cross the Maya train, no. The Maya train is a mega project to territory reorder, not only real train, no. And because for many researchers, we see a great problem to this mega project. The first is the ecological impact. The second is the economic impact in the population. Why? Because we see other mega projects in the last time, in the last government like this, no? And how we see the population is how do you say, displacement, no, to the benefit economic, no. Never see in the Mexico history how this mega project benefit to the population, no. On the other part, have many problems to health, problems to work, problems to water, to have water, a good water, no, and many problems. If we see this mega project, we have a big problem. All the problem we see in other mega project to other government, we see all in this case is a really ecological problem that impacts America, Central America, Latin America, and for example, to me, I live in Chiapas, and also impact to me, and also impact in the big city. Why? Because that population to displace to the land or lands or then in the village, where go to the city, no? And how this the change to this population, no? Mendigate, acts to access education, to access work. I think this is a very big problem. And I don't know if I answer or no. Thank you, and excuse my English.
No, you're welcome. Thank you so much. Then I would think that Philip might continue, and then we will have Joseph. Philip, please.
Yes. Yeah, I would start with the question about the president elections in Colombia, which frankly I cannot answer because it seems to me like elections in Colombia are something like a black box. That in the first round of the elections that happened last Sunday, the leftist candidate Gustavo Petro actually won or got the most votes. Was not that surprising, but that the second most vote, I mean, someone won the second most votes who actually was not on the screen of no one or in the view of no one before. Just 2 months ago, he didn't even appear in the how do you say that, the public quest. How do you say that when you make like, oh, I'm missing the word. So it was someone, and it's not even a politician. He has owned his nickname like the Colombian Trump in the last days, and it's hard to imagine that a person like this one can be the president of a country, but it happened before in the United States. It happened all around the world. So I'm really afraid that when the opposition or the right wings of the country unite and back this guy, that he really can turn out to be the president. So I'm a bit, even though we know the history of elections and of popular elections around the peace agreement, that there was an consultation of the public to vote for or against the peace agreement, and the majority of the Colombians actually vote for a no. So I'm not quite sure. I'm a bit afraid what will happen in 17 on June, when on 19th of June, when the second round of the election will take place. But yeah, I'm prepared for everything. But what I feel is important in the question you actually ask, Wolfgang, is the observation that we are talking about countries with like a strong legislation, with norms, with constitutions that's actually well formulated, and that we have governments that actually do not realize these lays, and pretty quick we are diagnosing something like weak states or dysfunctional states in these cases. And I'm always wondering if that's the right concept or the right terminology to actually describe these governments, because it seems, in my view, pretty strong of a government that you have strong legislation and you are able to govern like around this strong legislation. There's in Colombia a concept what I really like, and it's called cumplir incumpliendo. Actually the local, regional, national governments, they are able to perform that they were like realizing the laws that are written down in the constitution and in the laws, but actually in the same moment do not realize them. And it's really, I always see it not as a dysfunction, but actually as the specific function of these local states, that they are able to act in this way, and that they can actually use a structure like the state with laws and administration to actually, pursue very much private and individual economic goals and stuff like that. So I'm actually more seeing it like strong governments who actually can do it. And which government can like act by such a violence? I'm always impressed. That's just some quick thoughts about the notion of weak governments.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this opens the question on whose interests are these governments serving, and how independent can they be from certain interest groups. But that would be a huge discussion, and I fear we haven't the time to do it right now, but we still have to give Joseph the opportunity to answer our question. So you have the word, Joseph.
Sorry, I didn't quite get your direct question to me. If you can repeat it.
Well, it was about the question Philip tried to answer, the question of the relationship between strong laws and weak governments, and so whose interests are serving the Zimbabwe government, for example. That would be a question. Mm-hmm. For it's not too easy to, I guess, to decide. But you can say, well, they are serving the interests of the national bourgeoisie or capital groups. since the government has self-defined itself as a progressive one, and even with certain socialist intentions.
All right, thank you very much. The situation in Zimbabwe is quite complex. For instance, for a very long period of time, chrome mining was dominated by large-scale mining companies, transnational corporations. And it was because of the pressure from the government that we begin to see those transnational corporations releasing some of the claims to the local communities so that they could get access to the claims and start mining. So at that stage, or on that level, the government was serving the interests of the local populace. But again, there is also another line to it, or another level to it. By local, what are we referring to? Largely, you see that these governments, they are serving the interests of their supporters. So you have to belong to a certain political party, largely, the ruling party in most cases, for you to be able to have access to those claims that would have been seized from the transnational corporations. That's at one level. And then at the level of the involvement of Chinese companies, again, you see that the government now is largely serving the interests of those Chinese mining companies because of the international relations policy and their look east policy, so to speak. So there's several layers to it, and I wouldn't say Zimbabwe is a weak state. I wouldn't say the government is weak. It's actually quite strong, and in most cases they know what they're doing. They're serving the interests of the capitalists. They're serving the interests of the bourgeois. They're serving the interests of the Chinese mining companies. And usually towards the elections, the election season, you begin to see them moving towards serving the interests of the local communities by making more mine claims available to them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your contributions and all the interesting answers. So I think we opened up a very wide horizon of issues, which lamentably we couldn't go on to discuss right now, for our time's going out, as I see on the clock. Mm-hmm. So we have to come to a conclusion. I think we have seen several parallels and interesting differences. Parallels, the role of the state, the dependence on of the governments or their policies fostering their followers. There were, I see, close parallels to the Mexican tradition, let's say, of the PRI state party. And we have also seen that the forms of violence are very different, and that we could add on and to discuss more on how comes it that the forms are so different, and which ways can we see that we get out of the struggles and of the violence, of the physical violence, and that's experience Philip brought into the discussion. So from my part, thank you very much, and then I can pass the word to Brigitte.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Wolfgang. Yeah, I could repeat. Thank you very much for your presentations, and I guess from the number of questions, we as a panel did a very good job because it was interesting to our auditorium, even if you may not be able to see them. And I have also the impression, having searched again, that you answered all questions related. And well, perhaps to add a word, I think the questions and your responses to the questions have also underlined that, how to say, local protesters or grassroots movements, local communities, strategies show very well that even if it is not harmonious or how to say, neutral what these people are going to do and how they try to negotiate their situation is a very, very important factor in this topic of which we were just focusing on today. So the only thing I would like to remind our auditorium on, this was nothing but the start of the conference, and please do not forget to get back to the live stream tomorrow afternoon at 4 German time. You will have the second digital panel, which will be chaired by Professor Matthias Bös, and he is in dialogue with presentations by young scholars also on the topic and the overall issue of our symposium. I can promise you it will be also a very interesting and fruitful endeavor which will await you tomorrow afternoon. So it is not at 6, it is already at 4 p.m. German time. Yeah, and I think so far, thank you again. And well, I do hope that we will have one day the opportunity to do this again in real time, because it was already very, very fascinating how to say, to confront, to contrast these different case studies of yours, and would be very nice to have a class together afterwards. And this is something, well, we can just imagine virtually. Thank you very much, and good evening. Good afternoon to you, Elisa, because you are really evolving in other time spheres. And thank you, Wolfgang, for co-chairing.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all the presenters and also the audience for all the contributions. And we hope to see you soon in person somewhere.
Somewhere. Yeah. Goodbye.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Regis,
Thank you.
Wolf. See you, Joseph, Philip.